The New Orleans Saints have a new head coach, but is that going to help them compete in the NFC South? That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listen or view every day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers, here with you every Monday through Friday along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Continuing on here with our NFC South roundup, and we move on to the New Orleans Saints. Now, the Saints have gone through a lot of changes, but there are still a lot of questions surrounding this football team, one of which is the play of the quarterback, right? Derek Carr has not lived up to the billing when he signed with the New Orleans Saints a few years ago. He was in and out of the lineup last year because of injury issues. They have a lot of questions there, but I'm joined by Ross Jackson, the incredible host of Locked On Saints. And I wanted to start with the fact that last year this team started off on absolute fire. They were on an all-time heater. And then as hot as they started, things went downhill just as fast. Derek Carr got hurt. Their coach got fired. It seemed like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. So I wanted him to get Bucs fans up to speed with everything going on in New Orleans, starting with the hiring of Kellen Moore and what he's going to be able to do for the Saints.
Yeah, I mean, look, unless the New Orleans Saints are able to keep their players healthy, he's not going to do a lot for them. But ideally, if they're able to keep their players on the field, he should have a pretty big impact. The Saints did the thing that every NFL team typically does when they fire a defensive head coach. They went running to the offensive head coach, right? And look, it's not something that you do because you're panicking. It's not something that you do because it's a bad choice. It's something that you do because it's proven, like it works in the NFL. And so they go and they get Kellen Moore, who's like kind of this quiet, reserved guy, but is noted as an offensive genius and everything. And so they bring him here to New Orleans with the expressed intent and expressed hope for them that he'll be able to help to get this team back to some version of its glory days when it came to its ability to be able to produce on offense on a consistent basis, not just the first two games of the season. And then they bring in a staff that Kellen Moore is very familiar with that will hopefully help them out over on the defensive side, which has been on a steady decline over the course of the past few years. So Kellen Moore's got his work cut out for him, and it's all going to start with health. But even if it is a healthy team, he still got his work cut out for him, right? Like there's a lot to still address when it comes to this team. But I do think that they improved their head coaching situation, moving from Dennis Allen to Kellen Moore. How much is going to be all about what the team is going to look like in 2025.
Well, let's talk about how that team is starting to look for 2025. Obviously, the draft is still about 3 weeks away. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but free agency, we're in full swing. So what are some of the key additions that you've seen come to New Orleans? And of course, like in Tampa's case, a key addition was just retaining a guy like Chris Godwin. Obviously, they're able to keep Tyrann Mathieu. Cam Jordan, for God knows what reason, is coming back to play another year of football. But who are some of the key additions there for the New Orleans Saints?
I'm not going to disrespect the year 15 Cam Jordan, who's going to come in and be like the glue guy in the locker room. All right. It's the team going through transition. They need glue guys, and glue guy Cam Jordan is. No, but I think probably their biggest addition this offseason does come down to somebody that they retained, and that's probably Chase Young. Look, Chase generated over 70 pressures last year. He's one of the top pressure getters in the NFL, according to Next Gen Stats. Only had 5.5 sacks last season, so you'd like to see the sack number tick up, that's for certain. But in Brandon Staley's defense, where he's going to be able to be a little bit more of like a heads up for, or be able to move outside and be that stand up edge rusher over on the edge, I think it's going to kind of play to his strengths a little bit. Let him stand up, let him rush the passer in those obvious pass down situations, but keep him on the field for his run stopping prowess in the situations where maybe it's a 1st and 10 or whatever it might be. The Saints have been on this, like I mentioned earlier, steady decline over the defensive side. And a lot of it is because of the weaknesses that they've shown and the blemishes that they've shown in the trenches over the defensive side in particular. Clearly, like losing the line of scrimmage, getting moved off 3-4 yards before contact for opposing running backs, things like that. And keeping a guy like Chase Young around is going to help you with that, especially if you're playing to his strengths. I would say the other big actual addition in terms of a new face, James, is probably safety Justin Reed. The issue with the Justin Reed signing for me, though, or not issue. The concern with the Justin Reed signing is, like I mentioned when we were joking about Cam, this is a team in transition. And you sign Justin Reed to a 3-year contract, you're going to be ready to compete within those 3 years before he turns 32 years old, before you get the opportunity to re-sign him. You know what I mean? But if you're able to compete surprisingly over the course of the next couple of years, Justin Reed's going to be big for you as a part of either next to Tyrann Mathieu or eventually in place of Tyrann Mathieu potentially. I think he was a good addition for them. I'm curious about the timeline in terms of when you're actually able to maximize what it is that he brings to you.
Yeah, well, and of course, with additions come subtractions, and the Saints have lost some pieces. Who are some of the key losses now that the Saints have to kind of fill those gaps and try to replicate some of the success that those players have that have walked out the door?
Yeah, like I don't mean to say this in a way that's disparaging to the guys that did go and sign elsewhere, but the Saints didn't really lose a lot over the course of this offseason. I mean, the biggest name that probably walked out of the door for them might have been safety Will Harris, but we just mentioned Justin Reed, the addition there, and how good they were able to kind of replace that, or what grammar was that? How well they were able to replace that and everything. And so, like, they made a good signing to make up for losing a good player. They lost offensive lineman Lucas Patrick, who was inconsistent throughout the season. Peyton Turner was a one and done in terms of a rookie contract, 4 years. Now he's a Dallas Cowboy, never really produced for New Orleans anyway, didn't really produce in college either. And so the Saints didn't really have any massive losses this offseason. The biggest thing is going to be for them, when do some of their injured players make it back to the football field? Your favorite, Taysom Hill, suffered a December ACL injury. And who knows when he's going to be ready? Because not only did he suffer an ACL injury, but he suffered an ACL injury at 33, 34 years old. And so, like, that 9 to 12 month window is probably going to push a little closer to 12 for a guy that's, if you or I lose an ACL, like, it's a different conversation than if the 22-year-old guy loses an ACL, you know what I mean? Or tears an ACL. I guess we don't lose our ACLs. But I think that's probably going to be the bigger thing to watch, is who's available for them in terms of who's healthy at the beginning of the season. Because the offseason departures weren't super costly for New Orleans, at least the ones that are coming to mind right off the bat. But not really anybody huge for New Orleans departed.
And as things stand right now, again, a couple of weeks out from the NFL draft, where are you the most confident that they've improved over last year? Obviously, again, injuries play a big part in it, but they have done some improving there.
Nowhere. I would say that New Orleans, I'm serious. Like, I'm being very honest, and I'm very honest on my show as well. I like the things that New Orleans have done. Maybe they improved on the offensive line if Dylan Radins, who they signed from the Tennessee Titans, ends up being the starter at left guard. But really, like, so much of their offseason has been about run it back and bring players back and re-sign players. Even the players that they signed that weren't on a team last year were on the team before. Will Clapp was drafted here in New Orleans. Isaac Yiadom played for him in 2023. Brandon Cooks was drafted by him in 2014. Like, this is what this team has been doing. And I'm not like railing on that because it's a bad approach, but it's just a very interesting approach. We're going to find out if it's a good or bad approach, but it's an interesting approach because it makes it tough to say, yes, they've improved here, there, or anywhere, because they're effectively the same with some changes, but most of those changes are kind of paired with losses. I did just realize one loss that is pretty big for them, by the way. Paulson Adebo.
I was waiting.
Corner.
I was like,
I'm an idiot.
Cross out on Paulson Adebo?
No, I'm a dummy. That's all. I'm a dummy. So that's a place where I think, like, obviously, like, that's a spot where they probably got weaker, right? So it's tough to say where they've improved because they're mostly the same. And in places where they lost somebody, they brought somebody in to plug in, Isaac Yiadom, who was with them in 2023. But it's hard for me to come in and say that they've improved anywhere. But if health improves, then they will improve. The biggest improvement that they made is at coach. They moved off Dennis Allen. They went to someone not named Dennis Allen, and they went to Kellen Moore. And I think that that is where they made their biggest improvement, which should buy them a win or two this season. But we'll see what the health of the team looks like, because that's going to be the other place where they need to improve.
All right. Well, the next step is, of course, the NFL draft. What are the Saints going to look to do when they're on the clock? That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. Getting tickets shouldn't be stressful. That's where Game Time comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Game Time Picks curation makes it easier to find better value for tickets to sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. I just checked the Game Time app, and there are some amazing deals on some huge matchups coming up. In fact, I used Game Time to snag some tickets for a game I'm going to this week, and it honestly might be the best deal I have ever gotten on tickets for anything I have ever gone to. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's Locked On NFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, the NFL draft is now about 3 weeks away. I cannot wait. I'm so excited for the draft this year.
I love it. Favorite time of the year.
Yeah, it's up there for sure. But what is the strategy there for the New Orleans Saints this year, considering they have 8 picks, which is great, especially in this draft, but 4 in the top 100, 5 in the top 115. The Saints can do some serious damage here. So what's the game plan?
Yeah, little change on that. They actually have 9 selections because they reversed the ruling or judgment on one of the compensatory picks. Some of that they've mentioned that the NFL admitting that they did something wrong. We don't see that very often.
Ever.
And so the same, yeah, ever, right? Not often, ever. So they've got 9 selections, but you're right. It's those 5 in the top 115 and what 6 in the top 132, 131 that are the most important ones. And James, you've been diving into this draft. You know, this isn't the top end, most talented draft in the world, but it is a solid draft in terms of starters whose names you're gonna hear 7, 8, 9, 10 years down the road. And so you're gonna be able to get a lot of starters here. And so the Saints really have an opportunity here with those 5 selections, unless they get froggy and start trying to leap somewhere when it comes to trades and things like that, which they are apt to do. They have a real opportunity here to be able to fill that out. So I think when it comes to leading off the draft, really the biggest thing is that they're in a good position now to go best player available, right? Like they brought a lot of players back where they had holes, they filled them at least with serviceable players. And so there's not really anything that becomes a need. Like there are names that I like, but the names don't make the position a need, right? Like you could like Mason Graham all you want, but liking Mason Graham doesn't make defensive tackle a need. You can like, Shedeur Sanders all you want, but liking Shedeur Sanders doesn't make quarterback a need, although quarterback is a need for New Orleans in terms of their future, for sure. But I think that like they're in a position here, especially at number 9 overall, knowing that every team kind of has like 10-ish first round grades this year, and they're all, there's different players that all fall in that because it's 32 different teams. But there's they're likely to get one of those first round graded players that's on their board. So take whoever that is that's left, or the best of whoever that is that's left of that crowd.
Yeah, and that's something that David Harrison and I were talking about in Indianapolis at the Combine, and Trevor and some of the other guys that were there, was that like the elite talent isn't super deep this year, but you're going to get round 2 guys in round 4 because that's where where all these guys are stacked up. And luckily for Tampa, the positions that they do need are positions that are super deep in this draft as far as
Mhm.
that day 2, day 3 talent that, should be second rounders, early third rounders.
Mhm.
So, what are some names for you that you're looking for in the first round? And then
Yeah.
even, some of the guys into round 2, maybe even round 3, when we're talking about linebackers that'll be taken in round 3 that are going to be plug and play starters. We're talking
Man.
about wide receivers. We're talking about running backs. My
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Yeah, I just recently did a film breakdown on that'll be going to the insider program on Chris Paul Jr., the
Oh,
linebacker at Ole Miss, who might be like a third round guy, but like is an immediate starter for you if you want to be like it's such a good class when it comes to that. I think in round one to start there, my number one prospect for them that's realistic, right? That's not like, oh, Cam Ward, but like it was like actually realistic at 9 is Arizona wide receiver Tedero McMillan.
yeah.
That's the number one guy for me because he just finishes your wide receiver room, right? Like you got Chris Olave, you've got Rashid Shaheed. These are speed guys. Chris Olave can run any route in the book, particularly in breaking routes. He's really good there. And then you add Brandon Cooks. The Saints finally have a veteran in their wide receiver room that has been a top option before. They had a 7-year guy and a 6-year guy that were their elder statesmen going into the year until the signing of Brandon Cooks. But neither of those guys had ever been like the number one option in their NFL team offense. Brandon Cooks kind of changes that for you. But I think you can still go and say, not done at wide receiver and get a big bodied chain mover. And I think a guy like Tedero McMillan checks that box. It complements the speed guys as well, draws some of the defensive back attention. You know how it goes. So he's kind of number one for me. Mason Graham is definitely up there as well. He's probably less realistic to make it to 9, but like he's one of those dudes where like if he's there, you run and you get him. You know what I mean? Um, I like Texas corner slash, let's call him just defensive back, Jahdae Barron. He's one of my favorites in the class too. Like great culture guy, super, super smart player, can play. He's got like 5 position versatility in the secondary, which is always fun and incredible. And Brandon Staley's defense just loves that stuff, like just like licking the fingers and everything like that. Like awesome. So like those 3 guys kind of stand out. And then I'll put tight end Tyler Warren out there from Penn State because he's somebody that is often connected to the Saints. They really like him, all these other things. And I know tight end, for me, tight end in the first round is kind of like a cardinal sin. Tight end in the top 10 feels like a cardinal sin. But when it comes to guys like Colton Loveland as well as Colton Loveland as Tyler Warren, the amount of things that they can do, you draft those guys because of who they are and what they can do, not the 2 little letters that come before their name. So I think those guys kind of stand out. There's a bunch of edge rushers. There's some offensive linemen if they want to go in the trenches, which they're apt to do in the first round. But by then, we're into Friday's episode by the time I'm done with all that.
Well, and yeah, you see what Brock Bowers just did for the Raiders last year, and they got knocked for drafting him as high as they did, but he ends up being, if Jaden Daniels doesn't have the year that he has, I mean, Bowers is being talked about as rookie of the year. Like he was absolutely incredible. So a guy like Tyler Warren, who, if I remember correctly, in the college football playoff had all the receiving yards for Penn State against Notre Dame. Like their wide receivers didn't have a single yard. That's a dude, especially in New Orleans, where they use those kind of guys at the level that they do. That pick would make a ton of sense. I would be shocked if anybody was bashing on them for taking Tyler Warren in that situation. But of course, it all depends on how the board falls.
Yeah, and anybody that did do it is literally just going to bash on it because it's a tight end. Like, and if your reasoning is that oh, you shouldn't have done that because it's a tight end and that's the only fault you can find, then please have many seats. You know what I mean? Like, we're done here.
And I have to ask the question because it may be a guy that doesn't fit with New Orleans. It may be a guy that you don't think New Orleans has a chance of getting, but all of us have our draft crushes every year. Mine this year, Benjamin Morrison. In the past,
good one.
Was Chris Olave. Like I loved Olave. Who is your draft crush this year that you don't care where he goes, you just can't wait to watch him on Sundays?
Man, you know what? This might be a little bit of an underrated pick. I don't know. You could tell me if I'm crazy. But Deion Walker, the defensive tackle out of Kentucky.
Yes.
They just don't make them. They don't make them like this dude, man. Like a defensive tackle at 6'7", tree fitty, like they just don't make that. You know what I mean? And so I'm so excited to see where he lands, what system he falls into. Do they use him properly, and what he looks like on Sundays? He would probably have to be the guy for that, because I just like wherever he goes, I'm going to watch him. It's kind of like Kalijah Cansey, but literally the exact opposite. You know what I mean? In terms of like body build and all this other stuff. But I was such a big fan of Cansey, and I was so excited for anywhere that he ended up. And he's so fun to watch over in Tampa, and I'm hoping the same for Deion Walker.
Well, let's hope Walker lands in Tampa, and then you gotta defend him and Vita Vea.
Tampa's got enough with him, like him and Vita Vea. Like everybody just don't run the football. Just like, oh my goodness, I couldn't even imagine.
I'm just saying it could be fun. All right, we are going to get Ross to admit that the Buccaneers are the class of the NFC South. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Wrapping things up here on a New Orleans Saints focused episode of Locked On Bucs. We're doing an NFC South roundup. And obviously, Ross, I was giving you a hard time before, but look, this is a Saints team that finished last in the South last year. They were tied with the Panthers at 5-12. Falcons finished 8-9. The Bucs finished 10-7, win the division again. Now, I think we could agree that among the teams in the division, the Panthers were trending up the most late in the year.
Yeah,
Bryce Young looked like he's really starting to get it. They have a young coach in Dave Canales, and they're trying to get younger on the roster. They're getting rid of some all-time great. Shaq Thompson is no longer with Carolina. They're keeping old man Thielen. I don't get it. But when you take a look,
you got a thing about keeping the old players, huh?
I mean, sometimes like Adam Thielen, he almost beat the Bucs last year, but sometimes you look at it and you're like, is it worth it anymore? But like an old man like Levante David, he's still playing at an incredibly high level. Bobby Wagner still killing it.
Yeah, great comparisons.
So when you take a look at the NFC South as a whole, where do you feel the Saints stack up within the division as of now, ahead of what they're going to be able to do in the draft?
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 or 4. You know what I mean? Like that's where they are. They're the third place or fourth place finish, and maybe I'm underselling them a little bit, but I've been saying constantly over at Locked On Saints that I don't see this team winning more than 7 games in 2025, because it's the same team roster wise, effectively. Now the draft will have an impact there, but we don't know what the draft is yet. But you know how the draft goes. Everybody's an all pro until it's time to actually take snaps. And so we don't really know, and players need time to adjust and everything. So a solid 2025 draft class, unlike the 2017 draft class, which was incredible here in New Orleans, might not be known until 2026 or 2027. And so if I look at this team, the best I could do is give them a couple of wins, because it can't be worse than what they had with Dennis Allen at head coach. You got an offensive play caller at head coach. You got a solid head coach you were with Kellen Moore. We expect him to be a solid head coach. He seems like he's going to be a solid head coach. I don't think you've improved there, and so that's inherently going to improve your record. But is it enough to get them to the point where they're competing at the top of the NFC South? That is not my expectation at this time.
And last year, you and I on the division crossover, we were the ones that picked the division to finish in the order that it did, because we're both smarter than Aaron and Julian. But if you had to look at the division as it is right now and pick a team that's going to surprise a lot of people, and it can be surprising good or surprising bad, which team are you going with, and what is it that you think is going to be surprising about them?
Honestly, I'm really close to going with the Saints, because I think that if they do well, people will be surprised. If they do awfully, people will be surprised. I think that everybody just kind of expects the Saints to be like right in the middle. And if they do anything other than that, odds are that that's going to be surprising. But I'll give respect where respect is due. And I'll say the Carolina Panthers. Like you said, they had the most momentum as they wrapped up the season. Bryce Young started to look much better than I ever expected he would look like on an NFL football field. Like I was a CJ Stroud QB1, Bryce Young's not going to pan out guy and stuff like that. I'm still not fully convinced. I would say the jury's still out. He's 6-22 in his career, but he looked better than I thought he ever would. towards the end of the season. And Dave Canales has been a difference maker in two different places now with two different quarterbacks, or really other quarterbacks too. But really, like in the last couple of years, he's had such an impact. And so I'm curious to see if maybe they're going to be the one. So I would say that that's the one that I'm ready to be the surprise for good reasons going into 2025.
Yeah, I mean, they could be a legitimately sneaky pick. Yeah, I had Evan Klosky on a couple of weeks ago, as I do every week, and he was saying that he's actually a little worried about the Panthers coming into the season. He's not worried about the Atlanta Falcons. Neither am I. But the Panthers are a little worrisome. You give Bryce Young maybe another wide receiver, and then that running back room has the chance to be really, really scary.
That
Like,
Rico
really
Dowdle
scary.
ad. Yeah, that Rico
Yes.
Dowdle edition. And then they get the kind of the free agency bump of the healthy Jonathan Brooks coming in. And then imagine if that's the team that drafts Teteroa McMillan, or they go Luther Burden to get the yards after catch threat and stuff like that. Like, and that's just in the first round. They're in prime position to pick other players. Like, there's a real opportunity for that team to be really, really good, or surprisingly good. Let me say it that way: surprisingly good in 2025. I'm right there with you guys. I completely agree.
All right. Well, and let's get your thoughts real quick on a team that we haven't actually talked about a lot, and that is the Atlanta Falcons. You have the quarterback drama there. Kirk Cousins is not Kirk O'Chains in the ATL. They bring in Michael Penix, who they reached for in the draft last year. What are your thoughts on kind of what Atlanta's doing here? And do you think Penix, like, personally, I didn't think Penix was all that impressive in the limited starts that he had. But again, this could be a Bryce Young situation. We weren't impressed with him either.
Right.
And Penix could turn it around. But how do you view the Atlanta Falcons right now in what they've done?
I'm going to say something that might be controversial for some people. But I think that the Atlanta Falcons have a better shot in 2025 if Kirk Cousins is not on the team.
Oh, okay.
I think that you run into the situation with Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix being on the team. You know the old adage: you got two quarterbacks, you have zero, right? And so I would be a little bit concerned about that, right? The ability to be able to, and this is what happened to Bryce Young last year. Like they had him as a starter, they pulled him, they went to somebody else, and they put him back in, and all this stuff. And then like you punt the season when you do stuff like that. And so if at any point Michael Penix disappoints or comes on slow or whatever, and then they say, whoa, then they have the option to panic back to Kirk Cousins. And then Kirk Cousins is going to Kirk Cousins it up the second that he can. And then what do? You go back to Michael Penix again, and then you run into, like, we saw it in Indianapolis too with Anthony Richardson last year and the year before. And so, like, there's just all of these things. So I think that they're better off if they just stick with the young quarterback that they invested in. And if they do that, then I think they'll be in a better position. But outside of that, like, if I were to predict a division finish before the draft, which I know makes zero sense, but before the draft, I keep Tampa at the top, because you're at the top until you're not. Like, that's the way that I always believe it when it comes to divisions, especially this division, because that's always been the case. And so Tampa, I might even put Carolina at number 2, and then Atlanta and New Orleans for a dogfight at the bottom of the division to just try to escape the basement, basically. But, that's if Kirk Cousins is on the roster. If Kirk Cousins isn't on the roster and they give Michael Penix what it is that he needs, then maybe there's a chance that they end up holding on to that number 2 spot, and then we see a similar finish to last year.
All right. Well, since you brought it up, I have one last quick question. Let's say in this hypothetical world, Kirk Cousins is with the Falcons in 2025. Which backup quarterback takes over the starting job first, Kirk Cousins or Jameis Winston?
Ooh, man, gosh, I think I'll go with Jameis.
Yes.
I think I got to go with Jameis, man, because, like, here's the thing. No matter where Jameis is, like, Jameis is never going to be just a backup quarterback, right? Like, he's always going to eventually get starts. And so I think that your willingness to give up on an aging veteran player, especially when the fans are clamoring for Jameis, because they will be, they always are, is probably going to make you pull the trigger a little bit more than you're willing to give up on your rookie or effectively rookie quarterback, right? Like your young quarterback. You're going to be more willing to give that quarterback a longer leash if you're a good organization. And I think that's an organization that would give Michael Penix the longer leash that he deserves.
All right. Well, Ross, thanks for filling everybody in on what's going on with the New Orleans Saints. We will talk to you sooner than later, my friend.
Thanks for having me, buddy.
All right. That is going to do it for this episode. Please make sure that you are following along with everything on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @Yarcho_Bucs. Make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube with those notifications turned on, as well as wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to help support the show, become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes. If you don't want to become an insider, but you do want to support the show, take a moment, please. Leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to the show. Leave a little bit of a review. It does help other Buccaneers fans find this show. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.